Hi, I would like to introduce you to usage-based theory. Usage-based theory takes language to be a social human behavior, explaining the effects of usage on linguistic structure and acquisition. This lecture will introduce you to the background of usage-based theory and its general aspects, constructions, exemplars, prototypes, the role of repetition, adult-based change, and language as a complex adaptive system. In this part of the lecture, I'll take you through the features of usage-based theory, highlight the difference between universal grammar and usage-based theory, discuss some of the constructs of usage-based theory as applied to second language, and also the role of implicit learning. In usage-based theory, the following features are important. 1. Inputs. This theory is input-based. 2. Implicit learning. Learners acquire language constructions unconsciously. 3. Usage. This theory states that language can only be learned through use. 4. Presence of a learning system. That is, cognitive induction. Earlier propositions of universal grammar state that humans are born with a language blueprint that guides the development of a child's mother tongue. However, usage-based theory posits that grammatical rules occur in language, and their understanding comes only from language use. This means that language use generates grammar and gives interpretation to meaning. For example, the girl kicked, sentence 1. The girl was kicked, sentence 2. These two sentences are different. The difference in sentence 1 and sentence 2 is created by the addition of the word was, W-A-S. It seems like a single word, but the word was added to the second sentence now relates a different meaning entirely. Got it? I'm sure you did. Now let me explain 3 constructs of usage-based theory: constructions, associative language learning, and rational cognitive processing. According to usage-based theory, constructions are the key assets to learning a language. They are the basic units of language representation. Construction constitutes all the forms of language: words, morphemes, phrases, all language forms. When learners use constructions more often, they remember them easily. For example, the word boy, B-O-Y, is heard by a learner and is interpreted or understood to refer to a male, a human being, singular, just one. But when the learner hears the word boys, B-O-Y-S, there is an indication and interpretation for the learner to understand that the addition of the morpheme S is to indicate that boy has changed from a singular version to plural. Therefore, the language learner is able to learn that more constructions can be developed from a single word to distinguish singular and plural, present and past tense, and so on and so forth. Surprisingly, we can see evidence of this within usage-based theory through associative learning. People are quick to recognize high-frequency words, those words that are being used most repeatedly. The more often a word is encountered, the more easily to be retrieved by the detector unit of language learning. Language learners store up usage and try to retrieve this used and heard constructions for their own recall. For example, homophones. We are one family, ONE. I won the game, WON. The words one and one, ONE and WON, are identified and interpreted differently in the context where they are being used to give meaning and understanding to the learner. The learner then understands that ONE means figure, number, while WON is a verb and indicates action. The use of these two words in different contexts creates an understanding for the learner and can be recalled for use later on. Rational cognitive process. This is the level of language development. Having learned language features, learners' knowledge has to fit into their linguistic experiences. Language learners have to be rational because the way they process their linguistic knowledge has to reflect in their level of understanding. The words they are likely to hear next are readily available to them and recalled by the detector unit because they should be able to tell what means what context constructions are used, and how appropriately they should be used. At this level of rational cognitive process, learners can use words and constructions independently, apply them to sentences, having learned their roles and interpretation. From these three constructs that I have discussed, construction, associative language learning, and rational cognitive process, I'm sure it is clear that the role of implicit learning in language is huge. This is because these processes hinge on implicit learning. Constructions are recalled, constructions are stored, and these processes take place unconsciously. This tells that implicit learning and knowledge plays a very great role in usage-based theory. There you go. Hold on for the second part of the lecture. Thank you.
Thank you, Omolola, for the first part, and I'll continue with the other two main constructs of the theory. Exemplar-based learning. Much of our language is formulaic. We recycle the constructions that we've memorized from our prior use, which means it is based on our communicative experience. Language learning is implicit most of the time. It happens without the learners being consciously aware of it. Like the construction good plus time of a day, and we get good morning or good evening, and these are the exemplars. We then get these exemplars memorized in our mind every time we use them. And I want to spend some time go through prototype as well. Prototypes are the most typical of their categories. They are similar to many members of their category, but not similar to members of other categories. People would classify sparrows as birds, but not geese, because geese probably have less common features than sparrows from birds. Emergent relations and patterns. Any complex system involves the interactions of many different parts. This kind of complexity also arises from the interactions of learners and problems too. Learning language is no exception. It's a complex system. The creative system of language emerges from a frequency-tuned abstraction of the regularities in our experience. People interact with each other, and there's a whole world for them to talk about. There's a simple learning mechanics working in the complex human social environment to analyze the language data. Usage-based approaches assume that all language knowledge is constructed on the basis of the input, and learning takes place implicitly during meaning-focused input processing. Many aspects of SLA can be explained with usage-based theory. Exposure to input is necessary for L2 acquisition. Usage-based approaches are the input-driven, emphasizing associative learning of constructions from input. A good deal of L2 acquisition happens incidentally. The majority of language learning is implicit. Remember when we heard in class that caretakers would repeat things for infants? Infants often make me for I errors. They would say me do it. This correlates with their caretaker's proportional use of me in certain contexts. The caretakers might say, let me do it. Usage-based approaches suggest that learners unconsciously register language patterns in the input, and these patterns are strengthened when learners encounter multiple examples in the input, which means, once again, high-frequency words. The sequence that the language emerges from can be predicted on the basis of usage patterns in the input. For example, the acquisition order of WH questions. What, where, when, why, how. Overall, it seems that there is good evidence to support usage-based prediction that language structure emerges in ontogeny out of experience. Processes like analogy, chalking, exemplar, atom-based representations help the learner to find and use communicatively meaningful units. Learners come to know more than what they have been exposed to in the input. The prototype is a good example of this. Learners who have never been exposed to the prototype of a category nevertheless classify it faster and more accurately than examples further from the central tendency and name it with the category label with great facility. However, implicit learning wouldn't do the job alone. Some aspects of L2 are unlearnable, or at the best are acquired very slowly from implicit process alone. In case where linguistic form lacks perceptual salience and so goes unnoticed by the learners, additional attention is necessary in order for the relevant associations to be learned. Learners learn a language from their history of interactions of implicit and explicit knowledge. There are some strengths of usage-based approaches. The theory very well explains the implicit knowledge of language and its relation to meaning-focused learning. However, there are weakness as well. It cannot deal with the more complex constructions, especially those involving two verbs or above, and syntactic embedding. It cannot specify how the generalization process is to be constrained, and it does not deal with the so-called poverty of stimulus. As we've discussed earlier, usage-based approaches study constructions a lot, and the frequency of the constructions really matters in this theory. Any evidence? Well, John Bivey studied the Brown corpus. It involves 1 million words. It probably doesn't seem to be good enough by now, but it was pretty amazing back in the days she used it. And she split the corpus into half to study the words with the final t and the sounds. Half of it has high frequency, the others have low frequency, which means that some words appear more than the others. Words like just, went, and, these words have the high frequency. And she used the participants of 41 participants, they're all native English speakers, to discuss if frequency affects the diffusion of sound changing, and she reached to the result of if the word has a high frequency. They're more likely to show deletion than the ones with low frequency, as the table shows. Word frequency is a significant factor in the variation in t and d deletion. Let's take the construction went, for example. When a word with the deletion of final t sound, you are likely to memorize it as when instead of went. With each time the pronunciation went is repeated, it accumulates in your mind in such a way. So frequency actually plays a crucial role here in usage-based approaches. Teachers can use the findings of these studies to manipulate classroom input to increase exemplars of a construction. So for your take-home messages, first of all, usage-based approaches are input-based, and learning takes place implicitly during meaning-focused input processing. And the relationship between quantity and quality of input is important because the input to which adult L2 learners are exposed to is fundamentally different in both the quantity and quality from the L1 input, which is typically available to young children. And we'd like you to think about how do usage-based approaches address explicit and implicit learning. And do you think it's efficient to gain success in SLA if the learners are exposed to implicit learning with the theoretical basis of usage-based approaches? We thank you for your time.